We loved our time in Vietnam.
And that's why we're going over 8 big misconceptions Americans have about Vietnam.
Before coming to Vietnam, we carried a few assumptions with us. Some obvious, others so small we didn't even notice them.
That it was underdeveloped, that Americans were unwelcome because of the war, and maybe that life there would be a bit rough around the edges.
But after spending more than 2 months here, we started to notice something subtle at first, and then undeniable. A lot of what we thought we knew didn't quite hold up.
And at the end, we'll share our honest thoughts. Would we consider living here as Americans?
Some of these myths might sound familiar.
And number 5 completely changed how we think about Vietnam.
Enjoy! It's one big world,
And who knows where you'll find us?
on a mission.
To 100 countries to live,
No home base, no borderlines.
asking what if and why.
Could we live here?
We'll decide.
We didn't just leave because we wanted to travel. We travel because we want to live.
Travel living, Noelle and Jonathan. Life's adventures have just begun. Before we start, let me just say that not all Americans think like this.
Of course not. It would be unfair to label an entire country based on a narrow list.
That is exactly the whole point of this video. Not to reinforce stereotypes, but to break them down.
And show that not everything is what it seems on TV.
Misconception number 1. Vietnam is underdeveloped. One of the biggest misconceptions Americans have about Vietnam is that it's underdeveloped.
And I think that misconception usually comes from people imagining development in a very narrow, westernized way.
You ask people in America to picture Vietnam, and they'll often imagine villages, conical hats, dense vegetation, and rice fields.
And Vietnam absolutely has those things.
Yeah, it does. But there's also this assumption that Vietnam exists a few decades behind places like the US or Japan, like it's waiting to catch up.
But when you actually spend time here, you realize Vietnam is much more complex than that.
Cities like Ho Chi Minh City and Hanoi are intensely alive and economically active.
You'll find high-rise apartments, fast internet, mobile payment systems, modern restaurants, delivery apps, all of that.
And Hanoi is approaching 10 million residents. Ho Chi Minh City already has more than 10 million people.
A city with over 10 million people. I don't think most Americans really appreciate what that actually feels like.
At the same time, Vietnam doesn't always look polished in the way Americans associate with developed.
Sidewalks might be filled with motorbikes. Electrical wires hang in tangled clusters. Houses are built side by side without yards in between.
And you'll see a luxury condo building right next to a tiny family restaurant.
In America, zoning separates life into categories. Residential here, commercial there.
But in Vietnam, development feels much more organic. It can feel messy and noisy, but also entrepreneurial and rapidly changing.
And just because it looks chaotic doesn't mean it isn't functioning surprisingly well.
You can get food delivered at midnight. You can walk to restaurants in minutes without needing a car or scooter.
You can take affordable transportation almost anywhere. And no matter where you go, you'll usually have fast internet and cellular data.
So rather than being underdeveloped, Vietnam feels efficient, developed in many ways, and still developing incredibly fast.
Misconception number 2. The traffic is too chaotic to function.
This is a really good one because honestly, it actually feels true when you first arrive.
And it's also kind of funny because if you think about it, how can Vietnam have heavy traffic if everyone lives in rural villages and wears conical hats?
When we first arrived in Hanoi, the traffic was a complete culture shock for us.
We had never seen that concentration of vehicles before, especially motorbikes.
People weaving through intersections from every angle. No stop signs, nobody staying in their designated lane.
If I saw this in America, I would honestly be afraid for my life.
And for an American in Vietnam, the question becomes, is this even functioning?
That's the misconception.
Because after a while, we started to calm down, and then we saw it.
The traffic isn't random or chaotic.
It's fluid.
In America, traffic relies heavily on rules and predictability. Who has the right of way? Stop signs, signals.
Yeah, in America, looking both ways and making eye contact in the intersection is how drivers make sure they are seen.
But in Vietnam, I don't think people even turned their heads. One thing we learned very quickly is that when crossing the street, walking slowly and predictably is actually safer than hesitating or running.
In Vietnam, Traffic feels much more based on flow, awareness, and constant micro-adjustments.
Less like a machine and more like a school of fish.
At first it feels impossible, almost like hearing a language you don't understand for the first time.
And we don't mean to romanticize it or say the roads are safer in Vietnam.
We just mean it's different.
And honestly, much more efficient than it looks from the outside.
Misconception number 3. Because it's a communist country, travel is limited or controlled.
Basically, that you'll feel watched or restricted as a foreigner.
This assumption is interesting because for many Americans, the word communist doesn't just describe a political system. It carries an entire emotional atmosphere with it.
People hear communist country and imagine surveillance everywhere, restricted movement, difficulty entering, censorship in daily life, suspicion toward foreigners.
And just kind of a general feeling of unease.
Especially for older generations who grew up during the Cold War.
In the American imagination, communist basically means closed off from the outside world and the opposite of freedom.
But when we arrived in Vietnam, we honestly weren't treated any differently than when we arrived in any other country.
And we've been to quite a few countries by now.
Day-to-day life in Vietnam actually feels pretty ordinary and open.
International tourism is everywhere.
Expats and people from other countries choose to live here instead of their home country.
People everywhere are using the internet, phones, laptops. Honestly, Vietnam probably had better Wi-Fi than most of the Airbnbs we stayed at in Europe.
You see foreign brands in the malls, and lots of small businesses too.
Of course, it is true that Vietnam operates under a one-party political system called the Communist Party of Vietnam.
But the idea that communist automatically means what Americans think it means, that's the misconception.
One of the most surprising things about Vietnam is actually how entrepreneurial and market-driven everyday life feels.
Small businesses are everywhere.
People are constantly selling things, building things, opening restaurants.
Even our homestay host was running her own family business.
And honestly, that feels incredibly common in Vietnam. Paradoxically, maybe even more common than in the US.
And just to be clear, this misconception isn't meant to be political.
And neither is the next one.
So please don't make political comments in the comment section. Misconception number 4. Americans aren't welcome because of the war.
This misconception runs deep for many Americans.
So deep that honestly, I think a lot of people don't even want to say it out loud.
Personally, before coming here, part of me worried how the locals would treat us once people heard we were American.
And many Americans quietly assume there must be some lingering resentment in Vietnam because of the Vietnam War.
Or, as it's called in Vietnam, the American War.
Not necessarily open hostility, but maybe tension, a cold shoulder, or judgment once people realize you're American.
And from an American perspective, that assumption actually makes emotional sense because of the enormous space the war occupies in recent American memory.
As Americans, we learn about the Vietnam War in school, through TV, movies, documentaries,
and stories from veterans in our own families and communities.
And the underlying feeling we got from all of that was that it was this massive tragedy.
There's this lingering sense of loss, trauma, division, and regret attached to it.
Saying that out loud probably explains why many Americans have this misconception in the first place.
But the reality was honestly surprising for us, in a good way.
Now, obviously, we can't speak for Vietnam or for all Vietnamese people.
But in our personal interactions, we never felt lingering resentment from a single person.
And we didn't try to hide where we were from either. We were completely open about being American.
People in Vietnam were friendly, helpful, and welcoming toward us as Americans.
And one thing that really stood out to us is that Vietnamese people seem much more able to separate governments, wars, and history
from the individual person standing in front of them.
Which honestly feels like something the whole world can learn from.
And this next misconception might explain almost every other misconceptions Americans have about Vietnam.
Misconception number 5. Vietnam is still defined by the Vietnam War.
Or as they call it in Vietnam, the American War.
A lot of the misconceptions we had before coming here probably connect back to this one in some way.
Why Americans picture jungles instead of cities.
Why people assume Vietnam is underdeveloped or stuck in the past.
Because for Americans, Vietnam is one of the only countries whose name immediately triggers a war association, and a very strong one.
Yeah, so strong. People don't just think of Vietnam, they think of Vietnam and war.
Helicopters, jungle combat, protests, PTSD, and that association is continuously reinforced through television and movies.
Movies about Vietnam are almost always about the war.
Which, by the way, ended more than 50 years ago.
And because of that, Vietnam exists in the American imagination more as a historical setting than as a modern country with ordinary life.
But Vietnam is not frozen in time and living in the 1970s.
Vietnam has moved on.
It has malls, air conditioning, beach tourism, hospitals that practice modern medicine.
And honestly, many of the same conveniences people expect anywhere else.
Of course, you'll still see references to the war.
But you'll mostly find them in museums, memorials, or historical sites.
Modern-day Vietnam is not defined by movie narratives.
And if you come to Vietnam expecting to encounter the past,
you'll probably be shocked, as we were, to encounter the future instead. Misconception number 6. Vietnamese food is just pho.
Vietnamese food in America is often reduced almost entirely to pho.
Or as some Americans say, pho.
And to be fair, pho is really popular in the United States.
Probably because it's delicious.
And it's also one of the few Vietnamese foods that many Americans can actually name.
But that would be kind of like reducing all American food to hamburgers.
During our time in Vietnam, we tried some incredible food, which we actually talk all about in another video.
And while we definitely enjoyed pho,
here's another dish you can add to your list.
Mi Quang,
which is a dish from central Vietnam.
And while we were staying in Da Nang, it honestly became part of our routine almost daily. We show you all of the foods we ate in Da Nang, what they cost, and why we didn't miss American food in our other video.
And this actually brings us perfectly into the next misconception. Misconception number 7. The whole country is the same, north, central, and south.
Many Americans compress Vietnam into a single aesthetic.
One food culture, one pace of life, one personality.
And honestly, that could be because Vietnam looks pretty small on a map compared to the United States.
Or because most visitors only go to 1 or 2 places, and usually for a short amount of time.
But Vietnam is actually a very long country that changes dramatically from region to region.
One of the first things we saw when we arrived at the airport in Hanoi was this massive mural.
And it did such a good job showcasing the different cultures, peoples, and regions of Vietnam.
Americans understand that Europe is diverse,
but then unconsciously flatten Asian countries into one single experience.
Even something as simple as pho changes depending on where you are.
Pho eaten in the north tastes different than pho in the south.
And then you have dishes from central Vietnam like mi Quang that many Americans have never even heard of.
And honestly, realizing how much variation exists within every country makes our mission of living in 100 countries infinitely more complex.
Because after spending more than 2 months in Vietnam,
we can honestly say we haven't even seen the smallest part of it yet.
Misconception number 8. Vietnam isn't a tourist place. It's not a place you go on a vacation. This last misconception is a little less explicit.
Most Americans probably wouldn't actually say out loud, Vietnam isn't a tourist destination.
But subconsciously, many people still don't place Vietnam in the same mental category as places like Italy, Japan, Hawaii, or even Thailand.
Vietnam just feels more mysterious, maybe more difficult to go to.
So when Americans picture vacation destinations, Vietnam usually isn't the first place that comes to mind.
But in our humble opinion, it probably should be.
And one of the reasons is because ordinary life is still blended into the tourism experience.
And you can still stay in the home of a Vietnamese family running a homestay downstairs.
You can walk outside and immediately feel like you're part of everyday life, instead of inside some isolated tourist bubble.
And honestly, Vietnam doesn't feel overly groomed for tourists. And compared to many Western countries, Vietnam can also be surprisingly affordable for long-term travel.
Which is exactly what makes it feel so real.
Travel isn't always about vacations or buying souvenirs.
It can also be about living differently, breaking routines, and challenging perspectives.
I agree. That was well said.
And now it's time to answer the big question.
Could we actually see ourselves living here?
And honestly,
Yeah.
we could. After spending more than 2 months in Vietnam, we can genuinely see ourselves coming back and living here again.
We might as well now that we learned how to cross the street.
But for now,
We're excited to continue exploring more places around the world.
and hopefully challenge a few more misconceptions along the way.